This episode of Keys to the Shop is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Whether it's espresso machines, manual brewing devices, or general coffee shop needs, they seek to pursue the most innovative coffee products, both domestic and abroad, to offer their customers. Find out more at prima-coffee.com. This is Keys to the Shop, episode 40, Pour Over and Batch Brew Part 2, with Ryan Soeder. Hey everybody, and welcome to Keys to the Shop, a podcast dedicated to giving you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. Really excited to have you here today. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show. Today's show is a follow-up to episode 34, also with Ryan Soeder, where we talked about pour over and batch brew, and talking in terms of how, if all quality is equal, Ryan kind of gave his opinion on batch brew coffee versus pour over coffee. So what I thought would be a great accompaniment to that episode would be to dive a little bit deeper into each brew method and explore sort of the ins and outs and things that you're going to want to pay attention to if you are doing that brew method in your shop primarily, and if you're doing both. So what you end up with here today is Ryan is going to take us through the kind of a cost-benefit analysis, like what are the positives, like the pros and the cons of each one that you should be prepared for if you're going to do primarily batch brew or primarily pour over or exclusively on each of those, and then things to consider when you're launching those things in your store, ultimately so that you can have a successful batch brew program or that you can have a successful pour over bar. So there are a lot of things that do need to be considered when you're planning on doing one or the other or both. And Ryan does a great job of breaking down those elements for us in this conversation. Now, if you're not familiar with part one of this conversation about pour over and batch brew, I would encourage you to also listen to episode 34. You by no means need to listen to them in order. There's no spoilers in this episode. So if you're not familiar with who Ryan Soeder is, he has been in specialty coffee for 14 years, working with originally at Starbucks at their street level stores, and then on to training and barista training and educating at both Counterculture Coffee and Intelligentsia. He is also out there on YouTube. You might have watched his Howcast videos done while he was at Counterculture on latte art, and that was those are considered one of the main latte art standards now in the industry. So really awesome job breaking down that. In competition, Ryan is a past champion of the North Central Regional Barista Championships and also 9th place overall USBC. And he is also a past Coffee Fest World Latte Art Champion. So definitely has a lot of experience in the industry and brings a really great perspective to this conversation on pour over and batch brew. So let's get right to the discussion here. I'm excited to share this content with you, and I know it's going to give you the tools necessary to be able to do batch brew and pour over coffee well in your store. So here now is my conversation with Ryan Soeder. Well, how you doing, Ryan? What's going on?
Doing well. Good to talk to you again.
It's funny. We keep meeting here in this podcast.
We keep meeting here in this podcast after long days of work together and pretending we haven't seen each other all day.
But it's so good to hear your voice.
Always.
So in a follow-up to the part one, as it were, of pour over and batch brew, today is going to be kind of... we're going to talk about some practical things. Since that last episode, you and I have chatted here and there, and I think what you've got laid out for us today is really, really useful. It's super valuable, kind of a roadmap of considerations and some steps and things to really bear in mind if you're going to do a successful program for either batch brew or pour over. But there are a few assumptions that we're operating under, and I wonder if you can detail for us what are the assumptions that we're entering into this conversation with.
Right. So in the last episode, we sort of started with the argument that quality coffee can be brewed on either a batch brew or a pour over, and if that is a given, why would you choose to go one route over the other? Or why would you present your coffee one way or another way? Then we gave some opinions on that. And this is going to be more about why you might want to choose one over the other, or the things you might want to consider before choosing to mainly do batch brew or mainly do pour over or by the cup coffee. So on that quality consideration, we're going to assume first that these are shops that put quality first. So first and foremost, find which way you believe in. If for any reason you find that pour over brews a worse cup of coffee or batch brew brews a worse cup of coffee, that in my mind eliminates that right off the bat. So do a lot of tasting first. Taste a lot of batch brewed coffee, taste a lot of by the cup coffee, taste every kind of per cup brewer under the sun. Find one that you really, really love, that you think highlights coffee the best and that you are excited about and can stand behind, and then choose that and then go from there. So we're going to assume quality first. We're going to assume that you have a consistent definition for quality as well. So I would say that a quality cup of coffee is one that's brewed at a brew ratio that makes the coffee transparent and pleasing, not too strong, not too weak, and that you're also you're getting extractions that balance the acids and the sugars in the coffee in a way that isn't too bitter or isn't too sour, and really lets the coffee sort of speak for itself. So you can taste where the coffee came from really well. You can taste the work or the roasting really well, and everything is nice and sweet and not bitter, not sour. So we're going to assume also that you have someone in your organization that is very, very comfortable brewing and teaching brewing. If you're not really sure how to check variables and change your brewing specs and taste all the time and know what you're going for and how to achieve it, then it really doesn't matter which one you choose as far as quality is concerned. You're not going to be able to stay on top of your coffee and make sure that every cup tastes excellent all of the time. We're going to assume also that you're tasting frequently throughout the day and that you're checking your specs throughout the day and making sure that, quality control is very, very important. And then also things to consider are your hold times as well. So not just in the brewing, but tasting coffee. If you're using batch brew in urns or any sort of insulated situation, taste coffee as it sits, taste coffee as your vessels are clean versus a little dirtier versus too dirty. And know when you should be cleaning and when you should be dumping coffee. For instance, an hour after brewing in any kind of urn is a very different coffee than fresh brewed coffee. So normally you'll be, knowing when your coffee is not at its best is also really important. So again, first you need to assume that quality is going to come first. You need to know what quality means to you. You need to have someone in your organization who's very comfortable brewing and changing specs and being in charge of quality control. You need to be tasting frequently throughout the day and checking your specs. And you need to know when your equipment is affecting your coffee, even when you're brewing it really well.
So it sounds like if one of these things, let's say like hold times, are out of whack, it's really going to affect whether or not you can confidently move forward with any method and know that you're getting the most out of it.
Absolutely. Again, quality is number one. And if you don't have that, then really it just becomes a conversation about messaging and aesthetics, in which case I'm kind of out, honestly. I'm not really interested in having that conversation if your coffee isn't great.
So let's get into our first section here. We're going to talk about batch brew first. And within each of these sections that you've got outlined, we're going to talk about 6 areas of kind of a cost-benefit analysis. Those areas are labor, training, speed, aesthetics, equipment cost, and waste. So those 6 areas are going to have either lower or higher levels depending on the method. And I wonder if you could just start us out with a batch brew and give us the breakdown of what's the cost benefit analysis on batch brew. What can we expect from that method for our shop?
Right. So we'll just kind of get on the list. And obviously every shop is going to be different. But I think this kind of covers how most shops are going to look at these things. So batch brew, we'll start with labor and just say that the labor to brew a lot of coffee is much lower with a batch brewer than it is per cup, especially if these are your main ways to brew coffee in your shop. So we'll assume first that you are going to choose batch brew or by the cup brewing, and not a combination of both. And we can talk about that at the end. But labor for batch brew is obviously lower. It takes one person a very short amount of time to brew a gallon of coffee. Your ratio of product to work is really, really low with a batch brewer. That one person doesn't need to be their main job either. They can do that among many other things. They can talk to customers. They can help mark cups at the register or serve pastries or make tea or clean the cafe or stock the beans, and brew coffee. And that's not necessarily a dedicated person. So labor automatically super low for batch brew. Next is training. And I'm going to assume not training on like institutional knowledge of coffee, but the training to make a cup of coffee. You can teach someone to set up a batch brewer really, really well in a very short amount of time and have confidence that they are going to brew the batches that you want them to brew consistently every time with very little training. Now, this, of course, does not take into account, if a customer asks that person who they just saw brew that batch about coffee, that they can answer that question. It doesn't assume that if you ask them to change a variable or taste the coffee, that they could adjust or do quality control. It just says that they can brew this coffee with very little training. And you can have confidence, maybe as the QC person or the trainer or the manager, that the coffee they're brewing is the coffee that you set up for them in the beginning.
Sure. So you're talking about something that I think a lot of people have barbacks do, especially, when they're new hires come in and work particular areas of the coffee bar. It's easy to set somebody up and have them be adding value by brewing batch brew coffee.
Right. And this kind of takes into account also turnover. So let's say, a lot of coffee shops are hiring, we're not paying as much as we would like to kind of across the board. Some are getting away with it, and I love that. But you're hiring in the, $9 to $11 range, usually a lot of students, a lot of college people. Again, not everyone, but a lot of coffee shops are. And so you have turnover as the summer comes up and turnover as the school year, fluctuates. And what this does is make sure that or if you were to have 5 people leave at once, it does not ruin your organization. You can still brew coffee reasonably well with that new trainee that just learned about coffee and just comes in. You can say, hey, look, here's how you grind it. Here's how we put it into the filter. Here's how you set it up. Make sure the filter looks like this. Make sure the urn is below the brewer basket. Hit that button and make sure to stir it after it brews. That is going to be just as good a coffee as the most knowledgeable person on how to set up a batch brewer.
Right. So the danger, I guess, it would be in its simplicity as its saving grace in many situations. It can also be kind of it can be an excuse to not check the variables, and the low amount of training that batch brew takes. Maybe people could use it as an excuse to not check the quality of the coffee as much as they should.
Right. But again, we're going to assume that this is an organization that values quality and has someone who is checking on this stuff.
See, there you go. Right. So what's next here?
So next is speed. It's very difficult to argue that batch brew is not faster. Just the ability to brew a gallon of coffee and serve, 10 cups of coffee out of that to customers very, very quickly. Super fast. And a lot of coffee shops are making money based on how many cups of coffee they sell, not charging a lot per cup of coffee. This can be offset by things like whole bean sales or merchandise, or, if you have a really good margin on pastries. But usually it's serving a lot of coffee quickly that makes money in a coffee shop, not serving few high ticket items. So that speed is something to consider when you're looking at your P&Ls. Also, customers tend to not want to wait for coffee. And again, this depends on your shop and your customers. But in general, people tend to assume that when they order a cup of coffee, they can get it quickly. And so the speed aspect is a highlight for batch brew.
That's awesome. I used to tell people when I was doing barista training, the timer in the customer's head really starts when they get their change back. at the register. And oftentimes, I mean, what is it? Like double or triple the amount of time that it actually took to get the coffee versus what they're perceiving the time it took to get the coffee is.
I have heard that. I haven't read that study. And I've not seen the papers on that, but I believe it.
I see it in their eyes. I think that's a like white paper enough is the white of their eyes. That's what I get it from.
I think that's a hard one. I'm like, as someone who is in coffee all the time and coffee is all I think about, I'm not really, I have no idea what a normal person thinks and feels when they're in a coffee shop.
Oh, that's tragic and useful at the same time. So cool. So it's faster. It's faster. And low labor, low training, you don't have to train somebody for a day or two or longer to do batch brew. It's like maybe in 15 minutes almost. And it's faster. So what else?
Yeah, so next we're going to talk about aesthetics. In aesthetics is where batch brew tends to suffer a little bit more because of that classic, good, fast, cheap conundrum where you can get something fast and cheap but not good. You can have something good and cheap, but it's not going to be fast. You can pick two of the three things. And customers tend to assume that something that they ordered and was given to them right away and didn't cost very much just can't be as good as something that cost a lot and took a while. So you tend to communicate unintentionally with batch brew that the coffee just isn't as good as it could be if you were to slave over it with your hands and take a little while and make someone wait for it. In the aesthetics of it and the perceived value of that cup, you tend not to have someone whose job it is to just talk about coffee all of the time and who looks like the person who you should be asking about coffee. So with a batch brew, you have to work really hard to make this cup of coffee look and seem like it's the best cup of coffee that person could have ordered. And also be willing to really engage with people and to make it seem like the coffee that you just handed them right off the bat as soon as they ordered it is fantastic. That's a fight you do when you do batch brew, is that people tend to view it as a lesser product.
Yeah, so people are always cognizant of their own internal sort of tension where they value their time and they value simplicity oftentimes, especially in a coffee shop environment. But then measured against the value they think they're getting for the amount of time that they wait and what they get, it's like you almost, I don't want to say you can't win, but you have to weigh, like there's always going to be a tension between the two, especially like talking about batch brew where you might just not offend them, maybe offend them that it took no time at all. So why did I pay this amount of money for this coffee if it didn't take that much
and that's
time?
Something, and that's been driven into us, everywhere, like fast food. Unfortunately, like coffee tends to be a fast food model again because of, we're not, I won't say we're not charging enough, but we can't charge enough right now to make it take a while. So we need to sell a lot of cups of coffee to pay rent. And our shops tend to be set up to look like fast food, or to operate that way. And so people don't automatically assume that it's the highest quality they can get. I don't know. It just feels weird to charge $10 for a cup of coffee. I think that would be an uphill battle, especially when you're handing it to them immediately, just like at McDonald's, just like at Chipotle, and not like the fancy restaurant where they're willing to fork out that money.
Well, that's funny. I literally was just thinking about how the restaurant works versus coffee. And, our episode just previously, we had Eric Cacciatore. He does a restaurant podcast and interviews chefs and owners, et cetera. And it's a different world, and it's really service focused. They have the whole show in the front of house is a huge production versus what we do because we're all just out front. We have basically the same thing that restaurants do, which is a large amount of food in one container. The only difference is that they're, I don't know what you're making in your restaurant, but if you're ladling that thing out in front of the customer from a large batch, you're probably not going to get as much money for it, but they're still doing that just behind closed doors. They don't see that.
Yeah. It's like if people in restaurants were served by the same high-end kitchen, just without servers and without that wall, what would they think of the food. And that's an argument. That's an argument for aesthetics. And that's what you sacrifice a little bit of when you do batch brew. So next we're going to talk about equipment cost. And this is where, aesthetics, equipment cost, and waste, batch brew, you're fighting an uphill battle here. A really good brewer is expensive, and you're talking somewhere in the $3,000 to $4,000 range for something really nice. And you're talking about, things are going to break. You're going to have to call your tech. It's going to be putting out more or less water than you want. You're going to have to be really on top of your water filtration. You're going to have someone who knows how to work on the machine or knows how to dive into the menus on these machines and change all the parameters in there. They're fantastic, but they do break. And when they break, you are screwed if you don't have someone in there immediately to fix it.
We just had this happen.
Yeah. Oh, man, it's awful. And we have an in-house tech, and that's fantastic. And he brought a new brewer. So that guy's a monster.
Yeah.
But if you don't have that, you're calling a tech to come do that. And we pay our tech, and it costs us money, and it's because we have fancy machines that need work all the time.
Yeah. Man, I see those invoices. Believe me, it's not pretty.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what happens when you trade labor for machinery. I think anywhere across the board, and you can go down the rabbit hole with that, is like, at what point can you not make the same product that a person could, and how expensive is the machine that can do the same thing that a person can? And the better it is and the closer it gets, the more it costs. So a really good brewer is going to cost you quite a bit upfront, and quite a bit to maintain.
Sure.
People don't think about water filtration and how it affects their equipment very often. I won't say very often. I know many people who do, but you have to factor that in. You have to get a really nice water filtration system, both for the taste of your coffee, obviously, but also just to make sure your equipment isn't going down all the time. Yeah, scale is a beast.
It is, and it's easy to forget about filtration that you have. Like, you install it sometimes and just forget about it for too long, and if you don't have a schedule for that, then it probably won't get done.
Right. So next, waste, and waste with a batch brew is going to be higher almost by default. We talked about earlier, like, what if you're going to keep quality up, then you have to know when your coffee isn't going to taste as good as it could. And there are a lot of reasons for this. A lot of compounds break down at high temperatures over time. Oxidation can occur over time. So just like that, all those wonderful, perfect things that you dialed in for, and you tasted the batch right after you brewed it and you felt great about it, these things start to break down over time. And knowing when that coffee, you just can't stand behind it anymore, is really important. And when that time rolls around, you need to dump that coffee if you're going to keep quality up. And that can be a lot. Especially if you're, maybe you have two different batch sizes, one for slow times, one for, busy times, but there is going to be that weird few hours in between where you don't quite catch it, and you're going to have to dump a couple gallons of coffee, and that's hard. Also, what happens when something goes wrong and you have to dump a batch? If you brew a 12-ounce cup of coffee with a pour over incorrectly, you lose 12 ounces of coffee. Let's say your barista isn't paying attention and grinds on the wrong setting for a batch brew. That's a gallon or more of coffee down the drain, and that's not great.
Okay, so labor is low, the training is low, speed it's a fast process, and the aesthetics could be better, and they're not the greatest. The equipment cost is pretty high, and there's a lot of outliers that affect it, like filtration. So there's equipment cost and maintenance, and then there's high waste. If something goes wrong with a batch of coffee, you kind of have to dump the whole thing. So there is a lot to be said for batch brew being a good and efficient way to produce good quality coffee. And if you're doing that in your shop, there are some ground rules that you think are really important for somebody instituting a batch brew program in their store. What are those things?
Yeah, so the space for batch brew isn't so much of an issue, and the presentation and kind of choreography that goes into brewing isn't as severe with batch brew, but you do need to make sure that everything is as efficient and ready to go as possible, especially because if you're doing batch brew, you're probably really hanging your hat on that speed aspect. So make sure that your coffee is ready to go. Make sure that you have as many doses of coffee as you can pre-prepare, ready to get ground, to go in the filters, while staying on top of freshness also. So having vessels that can seal, doing tasting to know like how long not in the bag of coffee is too long to have a dose sitting prepared on the side. I would never advocate for pre-grinding batch brews to save time, just because there's no reason. It takes no time to grind enough coffee to brew a gallon of coffee. So, staying on top of freshness in your pre-prepared doses is important. And be tasting really carefully at the beginning of the day as you're dialing in your batches, because your dial-in or your recipe affects a lot of coffee for a lot of people, especially if you're not QCing every batch of coffee throughout the day, which I don't know anyone who does. Not that you couldn't, but it's easy to let a lot of coffee go out the door without tasting it if you're not really sure of your recipe. So, dialing in with pour overs, you have more chances likely to taste as you go. Dialing in batches, the focus isn't so much on tasting all the coffee as it is getting it out the door. So you're likely to miss an off recipe, which again is not a given, but you need to be really confident. You just kind of think of the amount of coffee that recipe represents and be really confident in your dial-in and your quality control.
Right. Right. So I'll build up the structures of accountability too, to offset that convenience factor where, if you're brewing cup by cup, you can catch it and you can taste it more often. But if you're kind of lulled into this momentum of efficiently serving all this coffee, having an extra list or a schedule for your batch brew can probably help be like an extra brain for you to kind of offset that momentum a little bit.
Yes, that kind of leads into the next thing I wanted to talk about with batch brew is that like building in that vigilance and that quality control is really important when you're doing batch brew. So the baristas, there is a higher sort of mental burden to find areas to interact with customers about coffee. Whereas with coffee by the cup or hand brewed coffee, it's very obvious who your coffee person is and who you should be talking to. With batch brew, it's not as obvious who your coffee person is or who set up that batch or who the person with the information is. And obviously we want to live in a world where everyone behind a coffee bar is very well trained and very knowledgeable and engaging and excited to talk about coffee. But with batch brew, that isn't just handed to you. You have to seek out those opportunities.
Right.
So it's also harder to sell manual brew devices that you might sell in your shop when you do batch brew and don't also offer manual brew options. So if they're not constantly on display looking awesome being used, it's harder to have these conversations about how great coffee brewing can be when it's not on display all the time.
So before we continue here with Ryan Soeder talking about batch brew and pour over, I wanted to take a moment and talk to you about our sponsor, Prima Coffee. Prima is a specialty coffee equipment supplier that's based out of here in Louisville, Kentucky. And from the beginning of their company, they've set out to make the best coffee brewing equipment available to the general public. Now, their focus is on curating the best equipment for every need, from grinders to espresso machines, under-counter fridges, batch brewers, all sorts of pour-over devices. I mean, speak of the devil, they've got all of this stuff at Prima Coffee. It's kind of your one-stop shop for this. So definitely head over to prima-coffee.com and see what they have to offer in ways of brewing devices. And I know you're going to be pleased because they put a big emphasis also on not just stocking these things, but also having the kind of expertise that's needed to help their customers get the right gear for every situation. And I've known them since the beginning of the company. Really great people, great professionals, and I know you're going to be pleased with Prima Coffee. So again, just go to prima-coffee.com, check out what they have to offer, and thank you, Prima, for your support of Keys to the Shop and also supporting us in the specialty coffee industry with the tools we need to do our jobs well. So let's get back now to our conversation with Ryan Soeder. All right, so we just got done talking about batch brewed coffee and all of the kind of the cost benefit analysis of the labor, training, speed, aesthetics, the equipment cost, and the waste. And we set down some ground rules. So I feel like we're in a better place of understanding of what that method has to offer us in our stores. Now it is time for pour overs. Where are we in terms of the cost benefit of pour overs?
Yeah, so we'll just start from the top with labor again. And the labor for hand brewed coffee is clearly higher, especially if this is your main method of brewing. So let's say you've chosen to do hand brewed coffee 1 cup at a time, or even 2 or 3 cups at a time. Just because you're doing it by hand doesn't mean you can't batch. But if the majority of your customers are drinking hand brewed coffee, then that means you need to have at least 2 baristas dedicated just to brewing coffee all the time. In your rush periods especially. That's one person to actually physically put the water on the coffee, and then one person to support that person doing that. Let's say you plan on brewing 2 cups of coffee at a time on your main coffee. And just for right now, we'll assume you're only doing 1 coffee with your pour overs. Then you have to have one person constantly brewing, and then you have one person grinding and setting up brewers and preparing the water and getting ready. So when that person is spending their 3 or 4 minutes pouring water over coffee and talking to customers, you can have that next one ready to go. And in this way, you can serve a lot of coffee doing coffee by hand. And you can be pretty quick doing it. But it just takes a lot of people and a lot of labor support to make that happen as fast as you could do it brewing batches.
Well, you were you formerly were at Intelligentsia, and you helped kind of retool the pour over program at Intelligentsia too, right? Yeah,
just really focusing on workflow is really important there. And I wouldn't say that I retooled the program, but I would say that I, as a trainer there, really focusing on what it takes to brew high volume coffee by hand is super important for that organization. And to make sure that, all the coffee going out the door is super high quality and coffee they can stand behind. It took a lot of people behind that program and a lot of labor to realize that.
Well, something that I always enjoyed in going down to the Millennium Park store in Chicago was just, how efficient it was. There was a lot of people on, but it's not one of those wall of people that's behind the bar that don't talk to you. They're also engaging. So doing it very well. Like if it was a normal pour over bar, and not every pour over bar is like this, but oftentimes the kind of concentration that a pour over would require makes the person like even closer to the customer, but even more, the ignoring of the customer is almost more offensive when you're pouring a pour over than when you're serving batch brew.
Right. And we can talk about that a little bit later in this section, but it's interesting that you mentioned Millennium Park and Intelligentsia, because a lot of those stores are going to batch brew now, not because of the high labor percentage necessarily, but because of the messaging that they believe in. It's easier to talk about the coffee being good because the coffee is good, and not the coffee being good because a person poured it by hand. So the Monadnock location in Chicago just got a huge urn brewer. They can brew so much coffee at a time. And they can cut labor as a result, and they stand behind their product just as much as they did when they were doing manual coffee.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you look back, and it's not necessarily the eight people behind the bar you're used to, but they would tell you that the coffee is just as good or better.
Oh, I'm going to miss those 8 people.
Yeah, right. So labor is definitely going to be higher if you're doing manual coffee. Training also really high. And this is per cup. This isn't in general, because again, I would not advocate not training your people just because you have a batch brewer. But I'll say, like, maybe the startup cost for training or the startup effort is much higher for manual brew coffee or pour overs than it is for batch brew. To confidently put someone behind a brew bar and know that every single cup they brew is going to be consistently excellent, definitely doable, but definitely requires a lot of training, especially when you factor in the ability to talk and be charming and engage while you brew coffee, which I think is really important if you're going to be doing manual brew. You have this person who is seen making the coffee for the customers they're serving, and they kind of become the center point for the ability to point to your product and point to your people and your organization and your presentation and say that we are experts at this. Our coffee is worth what you're paying for it because this person is here to guide you through this. Obviously, there are many, many ways to do it, but the training required to have someone brew manual coffee at high volume while talking and while not seeming like a monster while they do it is hard. I know that it was really difficult for me to do. And as much as I enjoyed it, you kind of feel like, after a shift on brew bar, you really feel like you've accomplished something. Whereas after a shift as a bar back grinding coffee, it's still hard because you're doing a lot of other things, but coffee isn't the thing in your mind when you leave that made that so difficult.
Oh, yeah. So it's emotionally, it's more taxing to be at a pour over bar. You're talking with customers, or you, at least if you're not really into talking to customers. And I know there's a lot of people, baristas, who are on the pour over bar who really wish they didn't have to be because they're not good at chit chat, or they see a customer there and they're like, oh gosh, I should really talk to them, but I don't know what to say. That's a lot of emotional labor to have to go through for 8 hours or whatever.
It's true. Like this. And there are ways to avoid that. You can have your manual brew station on the back bar. You can kind of hide that person away from customers. But I don't know many people who do that, and I don't know why you would choose to do that if you're going to be doing manual brew coffee. And again, we're assuming that this tastes just as good as the batch brew option. Obviously, if you think that manually brewed coffee tastes better, you should be doing manually brewed coffee. I would never tell someone to go with the coffee they don't think tastes as good. But let's say, all things being equal, you probably want that pour over person front and center. And it is hard to train someone to brew consistently all the time at high volume and hold a conversation and exercise enough self-care that they don't emotionally burn out doing so. I think it's important to know how to engage with people, to be helpful and answer questions and sell things like recommend coffees and talk about brewing equipment, and but also know how much giving yourself is too much and how to have conversations and relationships with customers that leave you not just having to drink at the end of the day. And there are things you can do to help that. You can cycle baristas in and out of stations. I think it's really important to do so.
Yeah, that's a good consideration for people who are tasked with caring for the people, baristas, managers, and owners, being aware of the kind of energy going out, need to make sure that there's some kind of energy going in too. And a certain level that, again, this might be tangential, but at a certain level, you as a barista, you need to learn that, self-care and what you can handle and communicate that. But then also as a manager myself, I'm culpable for the kind of work or overwork that somebody does under my care. So,
right. We're talking about training right now. And I think it's important to put this under this category because not only is the training cost high to brew coffee really well for long periods of time, it's also high to teach people how to take care of themselves while they do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So next would be speed with manually brewed coffee. And while you can definitely truck through a bunch of coffee with labor that's high enough and with a good game plan, I don't know of any pour over bar where there isn't the opportunity to get backed up and make customers have to wait, especially if you're brewing more than one coffee. And this is if you can't assume that a customer is going to be getting a certain coffee, that means you have to wait until they order in order to make it, or your waste goes up. So I can have 3 coffees ready all the time. But if I'm brewing per cup, that means that if I brew 3 cups of coffee every time I see a customer so that it's ready, that means I'm dumping 2 of them per coffee I sell. And there are ways to get around this. You can price them differently so that your main coffee is a little bit less, or it's your crowd pleaser. So you constantly have that ready, and you're constantly brewing like maybe smallish batches of that coffee by hand. And then when someone orders one of your other 2, maybe higher price coffees or more eccentric coffees, you can brew that right then with the understanding that this costs a little bit more, and maybe the person who took that order can communicate this takes a little bit longer. We have this other one ready right now if you prefer not to wait. But during that morning rush, that just crush of people, even batching your main coffee does give the opportunity for people to have to wait. But that then goes into the next category, which is aesthetics. So you do have this advantage of being able to charge more for something that is excellent and took a little while, again, because of that good, fast, cheap conundrum. So if it takes a little bit longer and is really, really good, then customers are more likely to swallow paying more for it because of the perception that, well, it must be worth it, because why else would anyone put up with this? I can go to Starbucks, or I can go to, I don't want to talk crap. I can go to a faster coffee shop down the road and get a cup of coffee immediately for $2. Why would I pay $3 at this one and have to wait? It must be really great. And that helps build brand awareness. That helps build, honestly, a value for coffee that is undervalued generally. Again, we would love to charge more for coffee, but that's hard to do if it's presented the same way the coffee at the gas station is presented, like ready to go right away. Here you go. So yeah, your aesthetics go up, which means that your perceived value goes up. And again, knowing how you define quality, we're going to assume that the quality is the same for both of these, but the ability to tell a customer how good this coffee really is a lot easier with brewing it by hand, and therefore making them wait maybe a little bit longer for it. It also creates, you can do a lot of really cool stuff with manually brewed coffee. The equipment looks super rad, and it looks kind of sciencey, or it looks super steampunky, or it looks, clean and Swedish, or, however you want it to look, you can make it look that way really easily with your equipment, and the person brewing it has a lot to do with that. And you also have this person who is clearly there to talk to you about coffee. Like if I have a question about my cup of coffee, that's the dude. And they can talk to you about, the mechanics of brewing. They can talk to you about extraction. They can talk to you about the coffees they're brewing. They can talk to you about, the merchandise even. Like it's just clearly a person who's doing nothing but standing there pouring water onto coffee that looks like they have time on their hands to chat. And they should. So you should have trained this person to be able to do that if they're going to be standing front and center, with their hand behind their back, looking awesome in a denim apron, or however you want to present them.
Sure.
So super high aesthetics. The ability to communicate value is very high with manually brewed coffee.
Specialty coffee, we're always talking about how, we want people to want to pay more for coffee, because right now it's just not priced the way like wine is, or other things that are similar and maybe even not as involved in making. I wonder, like, when we're looking at the numbers and we have a really complicated pour over bar or a really beautiful pour over bar, and we are charging more for that coffee, I wonder, are we potentially doing a disservice to the industry in a sense? Now, that's a really big sweeping thing to say, by associating the price tag with the method, kind of by virtue of just putting it out there, when it should be the quality of the coffee itself. Is there a danger of just like burying it under a lot of aesthetic?
I think that there definitely is a danger of doing that. And for more on my thoughts on that, listen to the last episode about this.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I think that is the main danger of this, is that it tends to be, I think pricing is the main danger. Let's say that like keeping your business open is the thing that maybe should be your first thought. And can you serve enough of this fast enough at the price point you're selling at it to pay rent? Mm-hmm. And then just make sure that person brewing the coffee is on message and knows what your priorities are as a business. And I can't tell you what that is.
Right.
And maybe you're a roaster and you want them to be talking about roasting. Maybe you have direct trade relationships with your, producers. You're really proud about that. All of that is going to tend to get brushed under the rug. If the person they're seeing being most impressive is the person putting the water on the coffee, the message, at least implicitly, is that this coffee is rad. They did it like that. I had this conversation very recently with someone. It's this coffee shop that I'm really not a fan of. I don't think highly of, the product, the actual like physical coffee. It's clearly not their main, quality is not their main concern, but they do pour overs. And if you know about brewing coffee, they do pour overs really, really badly. And the coffee doesn't taste that good. But I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was like, "Oh yeah, have you been to this coffee shop? They really know what they're doing. The coffee's super great. They do everything pour over, and it's just so great that they do that." And that's because, and that's not because the baristas were talking about how great the coffee was the whole time. It's just because they brewed it by hand, and that must mean that it's great. So, I think that what you can do is, like, the boon is that you can actually communicate the very real value of that coffee more easily with manually brewed coffee. I'm not saying that you can inflate the value of coffee. I'm saying that you can actually communicate its real value a lot easier than you can serving it in batches. The danger, though, is what you are implicitly communicating, which is that the coffee is excellent because you put the water on yourself instead of a machine. So you need to find ways to explicitly communicate all the other things that make this coffee excellent. And that it's a trap you can fall into really easily if you're not staying on message, and it's a trap you can avoid with good training.
Awesome. Now, the next thing here is the equipment cost.
Yeah, the equipment cost is lower for a pour-over bar, at least at first. And if you're really careful, you can keep it pretty low.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, depending on what you're brewing with, and an AeroPress is not a pour-over, but we're using manually brewed coffee and pour-over interchangeably, I realize.
Yeah.
But an AeroPress is indestructible. I can run over it with a car, and it's probably going to be fine. A Chemex is not. So,
Sure. How many broken Hario decanters on poured concrete countertops are there out in the audience right now?
Oh man, yeah. Depending on what your bar is made of, your equipment costs can raise or lower.
Yeah.
But yeah, so mainly you're talking about a way to heat water. You're talking about a hot water tower. Those run you about $1,000. And then you're talking about scales probably, and kettles probably, and your actual brew devices, whether they're made of glass or metal. A metal Kalita wave, you can drop it. It's going to be fine. You might want to buff that ding out, but it's still going to function, perfectly well. A glass V60 will not. It will go away when you drop it, and you have to buy a new one. So, But yeah, and you can definitely have a very costly manual brewed station, but the option to do it on the cheap and still look pretty great and still brew excellent coffee is there. The other thing to consider is that your maintenance costs go down, because if you break a Chemex, it doesn't cripple your ability to brew coffee. You should have another one. So let's say you break a Chemex, that doesn't eliminate drip coffee for the amount of time that you can go get that next Chemex. You don't have to call someone out. You don't have to pay them to try to figure out what's wrong and pay for parts. And now, water filtration still is definitely an issue. You should be filtering the hot water tower just like you do anything else, for quality's sake and for equipment's sake. But again, your maintenance costs go down quite a bit. As far as equipment cost goes and being careful with it, I would say obviously again use the equipment that brews the best coffee, and then be careful with it if it's delicate. But number one, make sure it tastes just fantastic. Number two, be super careful if it's made of super thin glass, and that's the one you stand behind. That goes back into your training. Is like when you're finished, immediately put this thing on, right here and never anywhere else. Be careful with your movements. Don't let anyone touch this, but these 5 people, however you want to do that, you can keep your equipment costs much lower with manual brew coffee than you can with expensive machinery.
Awesome. So the last thing here is the waste produced by pour over.
Yeah. Again, we talked about if you make a mistake brewing a gallon of coffee, that mistake is much more costly when you have to dump it down the drain versus making a mistake with a 12-ounce cup of coffee. Now, again, we are going to assume that you're catching these mistakes. We're not bartenders and that we're taking straw shots of all of our coffees to make sure they're excellent before they go out. Maybe we should. That would be fantastic. I'm not sure I'd want to drink all those tiny amounts of coffee. But maybe bartenders don't want to be drunk all the time. I don't know. But no, so the waste for, having coffee sit also tends to be eliminated, because unless you're brewing larger batches of coffee by hand and keeping them in, glass containers versus insulated containers, coffee brewed by hand only lasts a few minutes before it is clearly too cool to convince a customer that it's, the hot cup of coffee they're expecting. But when you do dump coffee, you're dumping a lot less coffee. And usually you're brewing coffee for a customer when they order it. So there really is no waste. The coffee that you grind is the coffee that they drink. The coffee that you serve is exactly what they ordered. And waste and waste cost just goes down, which really should make you feel good, because, a lot of people put a lot of work into this, and you really just don't want to be dumping out coffee if you don't have to. That should hurt,
Yeah. I used to drink it sometimes my shift coffee or something, like on the pour over bar. If I worked a pour over bar and I made something that wasn't great, I'd be like, well, I'm drinking that. Like fall on the sword, take one for the team.
Just hating it the whole time. Just like,
it's my fault. I'll drink it.
It's a gallon of coffee. But no, yeah. I mean, if you're a quality driven coffee bar, you do know that when coffee sits, it gets worse. And, if that gallon of coffee has been sitting there for an hour, it's got to go. And, that's a lot of waste.
Yeah. Okay. So pour over coffee is a high labor item. It's a high labor method. It is also high in, basically cost of training. The training is high in terms of how much time you have to spend getting everybody up to speed. And then how quickly people get their coffee. You can have a good system, like you were saying. Folks like Intelligentsia, where you used to work and train, they were good at that. But you do have the risk of having backups, which inevitably happen. And then there's the aesthetics, of course, are high, very high with pour overs. So high, in fact, sometimes they can cause people to get the wrong idea about what's valuable about coffee. So we're always careful with that. And then the equipment cost is a lot lower, the cost of entry, and lower waste too. You're not going to throw out as much coffee as you would with a batch brewer. So, if this is what you want to do with your shop and do a pour over bar, what are some ground rules once you start launching this program?
Right. So just like batch brew, and even more so with pour over, it's really important that you have as much prepped before you begin brewing as possible. So when someone orders a pour over, you don't want to have to find your brewing equipment. You don't want to have to be folding all your filters right then and there, or like measuring out your dose of coffee, unless that's part of it. Unless, you're charging, a lot of money for that coffee, and part of the setup is part of what communicates value to a customer. They can watch you go through the entire process. But if this is your main method of brewing coffee, you really want everything prepared for you as much as possible before you begin putting water on the coffee. So this is things like having your kettles preheated any way you can. Or if you're using an electric kettle, having the water ready to go to boil, or having your filters pre-folded, set aside exactly where you're going to need them. Having your doses of coffee pre-weighed out by the grinder, ready to go into the brewer. So as much prep as you can do on this thing that looks like you're not prepping a lot is really important, especially, again, if this is your main method of making coffee. The workflow on a pour-over bar is super important. It's really important that your barback and that your brewer, they know the workflow, they have the choreography worked out so that when they get orders, each person knows exactly what they need to do in what order to get this coffee out as soon as possible. So having more coffees on bar tends to limit your ability to brew preemptively. So a lot of pour-over bars, you have the ability, since you're not brewing these massive batches, to offer more coffees, and that's really, really cool. But it can limit your ability to kind of fly through that coffee because you can't brew ahead of time. So think about how many coffees you want to offer. Think about the price points of that coffee, and structure it in such a way that if this is your main method of brewing coffee, you're able to kind of get ahead of orders for a short amount of time to prepare for rushes while still being able to offer really high quality options at high prices. You might brew less often. So something else to consider is consider all the parameters of the method you're using. So making an AeroPress is very different than making a French press. Well, actually, it's not that different. Making an AeroPress is very different than making a Chemex, which is very different than making a V60. The times and the time it takes to brew and the methods at which you add water, and your steps 1 through 10 of how to make this coffee look very different for different brewing methods. Whether you're going to pulse pour, whether you're going to do a slow, steady stream, whether you're going to add all your water at once and then walk away. It's really important to know how you're going to brew this coffee so you can plan what your next move is going to be to get to the next cup or to get to that service as soon as possible. If you use a pulse pour, for instance, you add coffee in stages. You can work 2 pour-overs at the same time, going back and forth, adding water to each. If you're going to add the water in a slow, steady stream, that means that you are dedicated to that one brew until that stream is finished or until you've reached your brew volume or your brew weight. That's a very different workflow and a very different set of brewing parameters than doing pulse pouring and bouncing back and forth between 2 pour-overs.
What about the two-handed pour-over?
I do not believe in the two-handed pour-over, and that's something that Intelligentsia was doing before I got there, and that they actually nixed, as long as we're going to use them as an example. And again, it's one of those things where it's like, I'm not saying it can't be done well. I've seen it done well, but the person that does that well for 3 hours straight and serves consistent coffee is a very rare person indeed. So again, like if you're going to keep quality high and you're doing things like tasting and testing these batches, you can use refractometers, you can use just taste tests. But picking a consistent brew method and sticking with it is really important. So I think the double-handed pour is risky at best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it hurts. you ruin both shoulders. When pouring with one hand, at least you can switch halfway through a shift and you kind of wear yourself evenly, like grabbing the next portafilter rather than using the same one over and over again. So I think that there are a lot of reasons not to do 2 at a time with both hands.
Sure.
But if that's something you feel like you're really good at, go for it. It's way faster.
Well,
just make sure your quality is up.
Thought I'd ask.
Yeah. So, and the last thing to really consider is that this person on the brew bar is front and center. And they will be the person that people want to gravitate toward to ask questions to, because everyone else looks really busy. If you're at a really busy coffee bar, you probably have at least 2 people working the espresso machine. You have 1 person on register. These interactions are super short. You have barbacks running all over the place, kind of like cleaning up and bussing tables and doing dishes. Then you have 1 person just standing there pouring water over coffee. That's probably the person you're going to go to say, like, hey, like what you doing there? What's up with this coffee? This was really good. Thanks a lot. I just wanted to say that. So that person becomes the focal point for a lot of conversation, and that is fantastic as long as they are ready and willing and trained well to do it and like super excited about the idea that not only are they a coffee brewer, but they are like the ambassador for your shop and how it deals with coffee. I think you mentioned earlier that like it's almost more offensive to have that person not want to engage or not have the energy to engage well than it is anyone else, because they're just standing there. And a lot of the negative interactions you have in a coffee shop are from someone who just isn't prepared for the emotional tax of that interaction long term.
Sure.
And they're not horrible. They're not mean. They're not even being rude. They're just like, they're doing a lot of things at a time. And it's hard to break that it's hard to build that into your muscle memory to the extent that your brain does not need to pay attention to it in order to do it well, and to free up that mental capacity to have a conversation and do it well and be engaging and be kind. So really think about that. Think about how to care for that person. Think about who that person is, and then support them as much as you can, because they're taking on a lot. The barback, they're doing a lot physically. They're running around. They're doing a lot of support. But the brew person is taking on kind of a mental and emotional burden that isn't as obvious when you just look at it. And I'm saying this as an introvert who works in coffee and has to have these conversations. So I've kind of broken them down to make it easier to do. I know some people really, really enjoy it, and this sounds like a really silly thing to say, but not everyone is built to engage with strangers all day long. And so just know what your limits are and do the professional thing and ask to be moved if you need to. This is where cross training is really important. If you just have one person trained to do pour overs, they need to be the person who is ready to chat and like super excited about it.
Yeah, I feel that one of the critiques that have been leveled against me, and rightly so, was my naturally angry looking face. Which, when you're working a pour over bar and something wrong happens and somebody's right in the middle of telling you something really nice and something really bad happens in your pour over, it's hard not to just like dump your emotions right into whatever you spilled or broke and not completely blow them off. And even if you behave yourself, so to speak, in the midst of that, now I've gotten better and I smile more these days. But it's hard for the customer to actually interpret what's going on as anything other than, a quote unquote rude behavior. And so it really is kind of a catch-22 sometimes, unless there are those kind of systems like you just said to say, ask to be moved, or at least know that ahead of time that what your limits are, communicate those things. And as managers and owners, you're going to have to maybe bring that up first and not just assume that a barista is always going to communicate to you their angst or their weariness or whatever.
Yeah, and this is maybe another topic for another podcast, but I think that emotional self-care is undervalued in a lot of these positions. And again, this conversation sounds silly to some people who are just like, you could not be happier to like talk to people while they work. But for people like me, it's important to know when you're starting to feel yourself stress out, and when you can like hear yourself and your tone get a little more grating, and knowing that in another half an hour, I might not be able to smile as much as I need to. Not that you should be fake with people, but it gets stressful, and people, if you're front and center and you're front of house and people, you have to give good customer service and present good hospitality and be professional. It's hard when you get stressed to do that sometimes. Having the owner or the manager or the person in authority say to baristas, look, I know that this is hard sometimes. If you need to switch it up, let someone know. We're going to be looking out for you. That's really important. It's also super professional to say like, look, I'm having a hard time, or look, I just can't, like my wrist is hurting. I just can't be on this station right now. Or if you're on bar, like for whatever reason, my Rosetta is going sideways. I'm super frustrated. I can't get this right. Would you switch me real quick just to take over the station while I go do dishes or something?
Yeah. Better
that than lose your cool in front of a customer and affect them. Like they should not be aware of these things. They came in for an awesome experience every single time. I would say like step one is learn how to regulate your mood and not bring your personal stuff into work. But step two is, sometimes you have to. You don't have a choice. Some people are not as good at presenting as others and taking care of themselves while they do so. And a pour over bar is the place where if those cracks are going to show, they're probably going to show there.
Pour over bars crucible. Yes.
Pour over bar is trial by fire.
Yes. Okay, so pour overs and batch brew, two different ways of making coffee, benefits and setbacks in each one. Now, I know that there are a lot of people in shops who have both in their store. Is there anything that needs to be said in terms of that the hybrid? You know, we do batch brew and we do pour overs.
Right. Or I'll say like one of the reasons we're talking about this is because we recently made the switch at Sunergos to stop doing pour overs. And the hybrid is hard to do pour overs really well. I won't say that. It is not as obvious when you're not doing it all the time that you need to be on top of it all the time. And of course, with training and messaging, you really can. And you can absolutely brew excellent pour overs all the time, even if it's not your main thing. What tends to happen is that because you're not brewing as many of them, you're not as on top of your recipes. You might not be as on top of your freshness. You're not really getting into a groove that tends to be important when you're brewing coffee after coffee. If you're brewing one or two a day, or if it's just not what your mind is on all the time, it becomes more difficult to make that happen quickly and efficiently and professionally, especially if you're not staffed for that intentionally. What would happen at Sunergos is that we would sell so few that we wouldn't have someone, front and center able to just bust out a pour over right in front of a customer, have a conversation about it. It tended to be someone who you had to pull off another station to run around and find the stuff. And then they brew it on the back bar because there's not a front and center obvious place to do it. So you kind of hurriedly brew it while in the middle of the rush, while other coffee needs to get brewed and while the person on espresso needs help. And just wasn't a good scene. And we couldn't argue for doing them enough to build a shop around it and make it a central menu item. So I would say that if you're going to do both, you need to have your game plan down pat for when someone orders one. How are you going to brew it very, very well so that when they order it, they're getting an amazing cup of coffee and take advantage of what hand brewed coffee allows you, which again is that high aesthetic value and that opportunity to engage with a customer who is probably, hopefully, paying more for something that takes a lot longer to put together. So having your game plan ready to go, have your baristas willing and excited about it and able to talk about the coffee, able to engage with the customer about manually brewed coffee and about coffee in general, and having a game plan for how to kind of corral everyone who needs to be involved to do that. I know that a lot of times, pour overs are a kind of a second thought, or it's a way to offer a lot of coffees. So let's say you have every coffee on your menu available as a pour over. It's important to QC every coffee on your menu as a pour over, which means that you have to have at least someone in-house brewing all of the coffees manually all of the time and setting recipes and then checking those recipes as they get new roast dates. A coffee 1 week off roast is very different than a coffee 2 weeks off roast or 3 days off roast. These recipes are not going to be good for every situation. So you see a lot of coffee companies who use manually brewed coffee as a way to offer more coffees, but then you have to wonder how often they're tasting these recipes and how often they're training on how to brew this thing that is ordered a lot more seldom.
Sure.
So I would say that if you're going to offer both, have really solid game plans for both and really take advantage of what both gets you. One is your engine room. You're probably lower cost, although ideally you're charging enough for each. But your batch brew is your cup of joe to go on the way to work kind of guy. And then your pour over is your coffee nerd or, people who really are in the know or kind of insider baseball-y or who just have some time and who are excited to sit and have a coffee experience. These are really great interactions you can have with people. And you can squander that without a great game plan, without really good quality control on that. So the hybrid for both can definitely be done. There isn't a reason to choose one or the other, but just make sure that you are prepared.
All right. Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground here and a lot of grounds, coffee grounds.
Oh,
Ryan?
no.
Ryan?
we've covered a lot of grounds with boiling hot water.
Yeah, it's a coffee joke. No. So any final thoughts before we end here? What else, what would you have us, what would you send us off with?
Again, I'm just going to repeat what we talked about right up top, which is that like whatever you choose to do, you have to stand behind and be really excited about. So it's easy to be excited about the flashy thing, the pour over, because it looks super baller. And that is an advantage to it. It's a lot easier to be excited about it. And know what you're getting yourself into, know what it takes to brew awesome manually brewed coffee all of the time. And if you're going to choose batch brew, be excited about that too. Like find ways to dress it up, find ways to communicate quality. The trap of brewing batch brewed coffee is that your mind isn't on brewing coffee all the time. Your mind is on other things. Whereas manually brewed coffee, at least someone's mind is on actually brewing coffee all the time. Like the institutional, like trickle down of that is that most people in your shop are thinking about coffee more often than shops that tend to use batch brew. So finding ways to communicate your values around your brewing methods is really important. So no matter what you choose, make sure that you stand behind the quality of your product and your coffee, and you know what you want to communicate to your customers, and you don't just assume that people are going to figure it out. You are the one in control of your messaging. You're the one in control of your values. So make sure that whatever you're using to brew your coffee, you are prepared to engage with people and be excited about what it is you're choosing to do and why you choose to do it.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Ryan, for breaking all of this down for us. I know that this puts a lot more kind of meat on the bones of our last discussion, and I know there's a lot of content here to help people be successful, no matter what method they end up going with and to what degree. So, and last time we said where people can find you. Why don't you tell us again, how can people find different like photos of your latte art, who are you on Instagram and Twitter? And don't you make marbles?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram as Ryan Soeder. And yeah, you can find my glass stuff at Marble Party on Etsy. That's not my main thing. I just love doing it. So yeah, feel free to take a look at that.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming back on the show, Ryan, and exploring this topic a little bit more with us. And yeah.
Thanks a lot, man. This is a blast.
Well, I'm really thankful for this conversation because it equips us, because it gives us a perspective on each thing, and it kind of brings into light some of the deeper layers that each brew method, pour over or batch brew, has inherently as positive traits and as potentially negative traits, or maybe just consider them trade-offs. There isn't such a thing as a perfect scenario. You're going to have trade-offs when you make a decision and you stick with it. But it's my hope that this conversation helps you make better decisions when it comes to deciding which one to go with, or if you've already got this set up in your bar, how to improve what you're doing currently. So again, this conversation took place with a few assumptions in mind: that your coffee bar is a quality first coffee bar, and that you have a good definition of what quality is. A very clear definition. This is what quality is for us. And then we also assume in this conversation that there is just an institutional knowledge of how to brew coffee in the store, as well as that the people in the store are checking quality all the time. So the key takeaway here is one method is not necessarily better in all respects as another, but clearly in different areas, each thing has a benefit that the other one doesn't. So depending on what your coffee bar wants to put out there in terms of the message about coffee, what does this coffee shop or this roastery believe about coffee? You're going to choose one to more represent your coffee than the other, or maybe one exclusively. We outlined enough detail of the benefits of batch brew and some of the drawbacks, as well as the benefits of pour over and some of the drawbacks, to be able to make an educated decision where you're ready for the hurdles, but you're also ready for the benefits. So the one thing in this conversation that really sticks out to me is that we as professionals are always fighting a kind of migration towards coasting, whether we're coasting on the novelty or the aesthetics of pour over or the ease and speed of batch brew. In each circumstance, there's plenty of opportunity for a barista to create a less than great cup of coffee and kind of slide into mediocrity. And I know that there is a lot of mediocre batch brew and a lot of mediocre pour over coffee being served right this very moment. I mean, you can listen carefully. You can kind of hear the coffee scream. Just listen. And so what we can do to eliminate that in our bars is constantly develop systems of accountability and be vigilant, to always be pushing ourselves to know what it is that we're putting out there in our coffee, and always develop systems to help people stay in the game mentally. There's inherent risks in both of these things and benefits. So if it helps, go back through this episode, give it another listen, take some notes. And again, my thanks to Ryan Soeder for breaking this down for us and joining us again on the podcast. Always an honor to have him on. So if you like Keys to the Shop and you want to learn more, you can go onto the website at keystotheshop.com, where you'll find all of the past episodes of the show. You'll also find the show notes on the resources page, which is just kind of a written format of the audio show you're listening to now, so you can have something to kind of file away and reference. And I hope those are helpful for you. And those also contain the same links as our show notes. Also, if you want to reach out to me, it's Chris at keystotheshop.com. And if you would, go to iTunes and subscribe to our show. Share this episode with a friend. And if you've been positively impacted by the show, feel free to leave a review or a rating on iTunes as well. And thank you so much for that. So I hope that the information that you learned today really helps you create better batch brew coffee and pour over coffee in your bar. And as always, I hope that this episode, as well as every other episode on the show, has given you keys to the shop.